So those of you who've been with us for a long time know that the issues surrounding the intersection of what's now called net neutrality, used to be called open access, has been called lots of different things over the years. But those issues and the way that those issues integrate with issues of corporate consolidation and sort of control of speech are central to our work, central to our mission. They're why we exist. We've heard a lot this week from FCC Commissioner Clyburn, from Mr. Salet, from Damian Kulash last night about the importance of these issues and sort of the moment that we're coming to in terms of some major decisions that are going to be happening very soon. The good news, as many of you know, is that over 4 million Americans commented at the FCC during their last attempt at coming up with an open internet order that can sustain a court challenge. The bad news for FMC is that earlier this year, the comedian John Oliver did a better job of explaining the issue in 10 minutes than we've done in 14 years. So with that, we stole his beautiful line of stopping cable and telecom effery, can I say that? In the hope that actually Time Warner would sue us for copyright infraction and we'd have a hubbub, but I don't think they're going to sue. That's a whole nother panel. That was Walter's panel. So anyway, with that, we're thrilled to have this group of artists and activists and policy wonks to work with Casey to walk through where we are on a lot of these key issues, how the public is getting involved, and what to look for the next 6 months to a year. Thanks.
So you guys were here for Damian Kulash's conversation yesterday, right? He was like, why the hell are we talking about net neutrality in 2014? And some of the folks we have on this panel here probably have that same feeling. We've got some real pros here, all different parts of the net neutrality advocacy community. And from our perspective, this is a no-brainer, right? Musicians know what pay-to-play systems look like. We've dealt with it with commercial radio and access to the airwaves. And we've dealt with it in venues and clubs, you know, so it's something like, we know we're not going to ever have perfect, you know, access to audiences in an idealized world, but all we really want is a level playing field where we have the opportunity to reach folks. And I'm not going to do too much of a preamble because I get a sense that unlike previous versions of this conversation that we've had going back about a decade or more, people actually kind of know what net neutrality means right now, right? It's really been a powerful and wonderful thing to witness musicians, independent labels, musicians unions, other folks come into the space and basically kind of speak with one voice on this. That doesn't happen very often in policy conversations. And all we're really saying is, look, we don't want these big telecommunications companies to pick winners and losers with our content. We want to be able to reach our audiences on the lawful platforms of our choosing, and we want to do that in the way that works for our business interests, and our personal interests, and our creative interests. So I'm going to hand it over to the panel right now, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about the work that they do around net neutrality and what they think is the most important thing that we have to be considering right now as the FCC finishes up its 1 millionth inquiry into net neutrality. Carla, can I start with you? Thanks.
Is this on? Hello? You hear me? Oh, great. Hey, good afternoon. My name is Carla Murphy. I am a reporter for an online news site called colorlines.com, where race matters. When people hear that, they usually think that the audience for Color Lines is mainly black, but it is extremely diverse. The most I can say about it is most people are under 40, but other than that, they run the map. At Color Lines, we're a very small shop. I'm one of two reporters. One, I'm in the New York office. Another is in LA. Then we have probably about 2 or 3 other editors. Just letting you know the small size. We cover the entire country. We have so many issues. I have about 4 beats, and media is one of mine. And I have to admit that it is, of my 4 beats, is the least that I cover. So I'm here to contribute, but also to learn. So I just want to let you know the landscape, you know, for alternative media outlets, we operate under a very tight budget, obviously. And that affects how we cover net neutrality.
I have a quick question for you right out of the gate. So, like, we know that it's very difficult to get an issue like this on the radar of mainstream media because, you know, in a lot of instances, that media is owned or you know, under the auspices of the folks who are anti-net neutrality. You know, the other publications that are doing really amazing work in covering issues that get lost in the conversation are folks like yourself. Have you encountered any challenges in trying to cover this issue, even as you know, starting to have the conversation?
Yes. I'm going to be frank. Net neutrality, just the name, the jargon itself, it's boring. My job is...
That's what we would say, fuckery, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, John Oliver, listen, he was fantastic. I'm always looking for a way to obviously make something interesting to our audience. The way you do that is to attach it to real people, real lives. The net neutrality conversation, as far as I can tell, is still very much a policy one. It happens in boardrooms. It happens in places where you need a pass to get into the building. And the issues that we typically talk about, they affect people of color, so it's immigration, police brutality, Ferguson. How do you, the people who are organizing around, the communities organizing around Ferguson, for me, my question is, how do I make them see that net neutrality is also their issue? And I'm looking to activists and all of you in the room here and some of you sitting at the table to help me with that job. And I think so far, I think a better job could be done.
Yeah, I think a lot of us would agree, and that's the whole purpose of having the conversation, so we can kind of learn from each other. Jody, can you tell us a little bit about where you're coming from with this?
Sure. So my name is Jody Griffin. I'm a lawyer for a consumer advocacy group called Public Knowledge. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Law School. And at Public Knowledge, what we do, we're based here in DC, and we advocate for consumers on issues about open communications platforms, including access to the internet. So the role that we try to play here is connecting the needs of consumers and the action that's motivated by great groups like FMC to make sure that what consumers are telling policymakers is actually getting translated to the policy that comes out of those, you know, buildings that need a pass to get into, and we try to make sure that the public's actually in those buildings when the policy is being set.
That's great. I would love to hear, Sarah, what you think about this stuff particularly. You just came back from some important meetings, but could you describe a little bit about what your work looks like and your history with the issue?
Sure. So thanks, Casey, and thanks for everyone for being here. So my name is Sarah Morris. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel for the Open Technology Institute at New America. New America is a nonpartisan think tank and civic enterprise dedicated to the renewal of American politics, prosperity, and purpose in the digital age. And we work on a wide variety of issues, everything from national security to work-family balance, and of course, technology and telecom policy, which is what my program, the Open Technology Institute, focuses on. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about internet access and this question of this great network neutrality question of who gets to decide what content is available to users and what content, how and under what circumstances users can access that content online. And we believe, my organization believes, that it's users who should decide and that their ability to do so needs to be protected from ISPs acting as gatekeepers who have both the incentive to discriminate or interfere with that access and the ability to do so. So we have been very involved in the Federal Communications Commission's rulemaking proceeding to try to figure out what the right rules look like in order to address those threats of harm. And you know, we really feel that we've seen now, as Casey said, a decade of harmful behavior, and stemming from the Madison River case where they were blocking a voice over IP application, to Comcast and BitTorrent, to AT&T blocking FaceTime in 2012, and now even today my organization released a paper in collaboration with other partners from a project we work on called Measurement Lab that shows significant periods of degraded access for consumers for periods of months, oftentimes falling even below what the FCC's now outdated definition of broadband is. So, you know, we're looking at this closely from a technical standpoint and from a policy standpoint and trying to figure out the right answers.
Great. Joe just got off a train where he was coming back from New York City, where he was at a net neutrality rally or sort of
Open forum.
What would you call it? Open forum. And you know, Joe's fascinating. Joe understands what it means to be a content creator because he's a journalist, he's an author. Joe's also a musician. I've heard his stuff. It's really awesome. Like seriously.
I am. Yeah. Okay.
But go ahead. Describe your whole thing, Joe.
Well, I work for Free Press. It's a public interest group here. We have an office in D.C., but in Western Massachusetts, our main office. And why I'll speak about why I care about network neutrality, and it kind of like informs the work I do. You know, I do most of my work evolves around race. You know, on network neutrality and policy and race, and I do that not all the time, but so much of the time because I really do believe that in order to fight a consolidated media system is terrible for independent voices. And for people of color, it is even worse. We don't own very few radio stations, TV stations, and for 200 years, we have been fighting to make sure we have access to the media so we can tell our own stories. The first African-American newspaper in this country was printed in 1827 in New York City called Freedom's Journal. And in that first edition of the paper, the publisher said why they published the paper. They were publishing against the racist news coverage in New York City, but he said, we wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. From the press to the pulpit, we have suffered much from being incorrectly represented. That was 1827. And we're still fighting for that very principle today because it is a life and death issue who has the power to communicate. It's no joke, you know? Our lives are told by other people who have no idea of how we live or anything about us. So we're demonized, we're stereotyped, and that can lead to all kinds of bad policies against us. At least to, you know, police brutality, to the Obama administration deporting more than 2 million undocumented immigrants, right? So how can you change public policy that betters the life of people of color or marginalized groups if you don't have the power to shape your own message? And then when they do tell you stories, they marginalize you. This is why the fight for net neutrality is critical, because we've been fighting for access, not just access to the content, because we just don't want access to content that does nothing to inform us. We want to be able to control our own dissemination of our own image. And this is what the fight's about. So in places like Ferguson, when the cops are saying they're not tear gassing people, but the folks who are live streaming are showing us a different story, that's why we need an open internet, because, you know, otherwise we get censored, you know, and our voices, or someone like Carla, you're not going to see her on TV or anything like that speaking truth to power. So that's why network neutrality is critically important. It is not a boardroom, it is a moral decision. It is a moral fight. Unfortunately, in DC, too often a technical fight, which it is. I mean, it is a technical. The devil in the details are really, really important, right? But you know, I'll end this to Casey. I saw the Citizen 4 this weekend, right? Who saw Citizen 4? Anyone seen it this weekend? With Ed Snowden. And the lawyer for the ACLU was in Germany, talking to other lawyers around the table, and he said, you know, it's interesting. 5% of what we're dealing with the Ed Snowden case has to actually do with legality of the law. 95% of it is with politics. And network neutrality is, we have the legal, we're right on the legal case. We know what's the right thing to do. It is a political fight. So that's the unfortunate part. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, you know, you can't have the political conversation unless you can report out on it, and you're using these, you know, communications networks to do so. So it's kind of a circular problem. Also, you know, when we've, you know, worked with folks in the music sector, there's a lot of overlap between the disadvantaged communities that Joe's talking about and you know, some of the systemic and historic you know, issues in the music community, right? And so I think it's important on a cultural level, it's important on a civic level, it's important on a political level. Jesse, you're a musician. You've got an interesting take on this. We'd love to hear about it. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about how you came to this conversation?
Yeah. I guess I sort of came back to it in a sense. I've been a full-time touring musician for the last decade with a couple bands that, you know, spent a couple 100 days a year on the road, and before that, I actually did some economics writing, some journalism, and sort of public policy stuff. So a lot of this stuff was very much, without going too much into it, I was mostly focused on creativity and innovation, and essentially how the arts, technology, drive not just economic development, but also community development, social fabric, all that. And, you know, upon meeting, re-meeting actually after a decade, Michael Bracey, just a little while ago, he kind of got me back into this, and have since spent some time. Last time we toured through DC, went up on the Hill and talked to some lawmakers and some legislative assistants. That was really, really illuminating. And then back home in Denver, started working with with Governor Hickenlooper's Council on Creative Industries, basically approaching a lot of the same issues. Essentially, how do we build strong communities that are representative of everyone and take everyone into account and don't. This is an absolutely crucial issue.
I mean, fundamentally, you need access to the resource. So that's having like high quality, affordable broadband in places that aren't just the major cities, right?
Yeah.
So if we're talking about cultural communities. And the other part of it is, are those networks accessible? Because, you know, one of the issues is we hear a lot that musicians are kind of annoyed with some of the mainstream music services. They don't like the rates, or they don't like what musicians are being paid, or they don't support the business model. You know, those are all valid things to bring up, but in order to construct the alternative, you need to be able to build on the internet. You need to have an open internet. Because we've seen too often with integrated media companies that, you know, they can kind of set the terms and lock you into these economic situations almost in perpetuity. So I think, though, that this is an interesting point because we've got all of the compelling reasons that we're still very much invested in trying to drive this conversation forward. But I think as advocates and as policy wonks and as creators, and we don't often take time to reflect on where we've come. I think it's pretty amazing that we've got close to 4 million comments in the FCC docket. That's incredible. The fact that you would get John Oliver with this, you know, segment that kind of rallies the nation around a swear word is pretty fascinating. So I want to know from you guys what you think the most inspiring kind of moment was in your advocacy or engagement on this issue, and maybe did you perceive a sea change in how people responded to it, and if so, can you describe what that was like? I'll just throw that open to anybody who wants to respond.
I'll start off by saying no. I grew up, I guess, in the time where you sort of took for granted all the things that you just have automatically. You just have the internet. I mean, if you come from certain communities, obviously. And I think it's only recently been for me in the last year or so that I've realized that this amazing creative tool and social organizing thing, like everything else in the world, is gonna be snapped up one way or the other, snapped up or protected, you know. So it's I think a lot about highways because I drive back and forth across them all the time, and some cost a lot of money and some are cheap, and I think about how that affects my lifestyle. But I also feel really lucky in a sense to do what I do, to be a musician, and for me this is actually it's not a music issue. It's much bigger than that, and I think music can play a crucial part in it, but I think it's a more important issue. I mean, it's about ideas and information and a free society.
You mentioned sort of taking for granted that the internet is just something that we have and it works this way. I wonder if that's working to our advantage at all in the conversation, because right now it's not so much should net neutrality exist. Okay, we've got folks at the FCC who, you know, say yes, we agree, net neutrality should exist. What they have to figure out how to do is assert their authority and describe the, you know, legal frameworks under which they can produce rules where they won't get their pantsuit off again, right? But I think that the idea that the internet is something that we know, like almost at this level, like electricity or some other utility, might work in our favor.
Well, I'll just say that I think the thing that surprised us, for me, it was a great affirmation, let's say, of the work we've been doing for Free Press. We've been working on this issue, God, 2005, 2006, right? I joined in 2007. So it's been a long time we've been at this, and sometimes feeling like in the wilderness, you know, in this issue sometimes, is the fact that we got 1 million people to sign petitions in 2 weeks after the court case. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a lot of people, you know? And it was an indication out there that that people that more people understood the fundamental principles of this issue than ever before. 1 million petitions in 2 weeks that we delivered to the FCC. I think one of the reasons that's happening is because people's relationship with these telecom companies and their own online digital rights, they're thinking more about it in a way than they have ever before. I mean, whether it's the SOPA PIPA fight that people thinking about their own online stuff, or even the Ed Snowden stuff. You know, you're thinking about like what are the power of these corporations have over us. And I think all of, you know, folks, you know, are broadband is still a new way to connect to the internet. It's only been the past decade or so that, less than that, the majority of people have access to broadband or are connected to broadband. So they're thinking about these issues and they're thinking, away, what are my rights online? And these companies that we're paying an enormous amount of money to each month have an enormous say over us. And so I think it's just an indication not only are that more and more people know about net neutrality, but they're thinking about these companies, how these companies function in their lives in a very different way than they did a few years ago.
Now, it's really interesting because we can talk about all the ways that you know, net neutrality is essential to what we're trying to do, whether we're, you know, advocates, artists, you know, cultural leaders, nonprofit workers, or whatever. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that you know, there's a whole bunch of very specific details that need to get hammered out to have these rules look like what we want them to look like. I'm hoping that Sarah or Jody can give us a sense of what we're asking for and why are we being heard enough?
Do you want, I'll start, and then what I forget you can add. So the legal fight here, and again, kind of like what Joe was saying, is that it's a great accomplishment that now we've gotten past the idea that, you know, should there be net neutrality, should there be fast lanes or slow lanes? I think that, you know, we've won that argument, but now the question is how to make sure it actually happens and how to make sure that we have a truly open internet. Part of the question there is what law the Federal Communications Commission points to as its source of authority, which I know sounds terribly, terribly boring, but it's terribly, terribly important. That was what made the last set of rules fall down in court because they picked the wrong law to lean on for their authority. And now what we're saying is that to make sure you have real non-discrimination, no blocking rules that are gonna stand up in court, you need to call these services, internet access services, a telecommunications service. Namely a service that moves data back and forth but doesn't process it the way like an email service processes your data. And so that's the question now, is that can they, building the political will to move to calling internet access services telecommunications versus calling them information services, which is a source of authority that I think would make it much more legally risky to try to implement new rules and actually have them be meaningful and stand up in court.
So this is what folks mean when they talk about Title II or reclassification,
That's Title
right?
II, yep.
Now, is that, if we move to that framework, can you promise us that we won't be back here in another 3 to 5 years having the same conversation? I want that confidence to come from you. And like, yes, this is the way to go. Is that the rally cry?
Title II, I think, is clearly the best way to go. That's not to say there will not be further policy conversations after that, and it's not to say that no one's going to sue because there's so much money at stake for these carriers. You know, if they have a chance, they will try. But it's still, this is by far, I think, the best way to go, and so that's what we're urging the FCC to do.
Sarah, you hear, you know, you guys know what we're talking about. You're probably on our team here. Sarah, can you describe what the pushback is? What are the other guys saying? What are the big ISPs saying? What, you know, what's their counter argument?
Do you want me to put on my ISP
Your Comcast,
hat for a
go.
little bit? Okay, so the ISPs, they're going to say, look, you want to put on, we're not doing, well, first they say we're not doing anything wrong. That's not true. History tells us that's not true. The data released this morning from our team tells us that's not true. And common sense tells us that that's not true. As the internet service providers become increasingly, I didn't keep my ISP hat on for very long, but as they become increasingly consolidated and vertically integrated where they own both content and the pipes over which that content flows, they have every incentive to make sure that their business models are protected.
So an example of that would be Comcast owning NBC Universal or something, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So another argument they make, they say, if you subject us to these terribly burdensome rules, it would be a calamitous reversal of policy. They actually use the word calamitous. And we will never, it will dramatically impact our ability to build out and serve areas that are presently not adequately.
So they're saying we can't invest in this thing called broadband that we know you all need unless you give us what we want. Is that
Yes,
basically
unless you allow us to charge companies to access end users. Unless you let us preserve this new business model that allows us to extract rents on both sides of the content delivery chain, that we just won't build
So
out.
what do we do? How do we push back on that? How do we say, dispel that myth that anything less than no net neutrality is necessary for them to build out that infrastructure?
Well, Free Press has tremendous research on this point, on the economics of build-out. I would also say that the best way to encourage that internet service providers continue to offer better and better service is to make them compete with each other on the merits of that service. So once you allow them to make money in some other way, then they lose the incentive to actually upgrade their networks towards.
It seems like they already don't have the incentive. You guys watch the show 30 Rock, or you're familiar with it? The fake company Cable Town. This the idea that, like, why would you want to build out if you're able to charge people 100 and something bucks a month for access to the thing, and you're able to charge the people putting stuff on the internet extra for the privilege of reaching these people? That's the business you want to be in, right? If I'm a shareholder, I don't want anybody to build anything out because that's expensive. What's a faster path to profit is just squeezing people on both ends. I want to get back to getting people engaged. Carla, you mentioned the idea of net neutrality as being something that makes people's eyes glaze over. How would you approach this if you were talking to somebody who might not have any clue about this, or your grandmother, or do you have any kind of insight about how you'd want to describe this? Everything you've been hearing?
My grandmother. Sorry, just laughing at that.
Or my grandmother. You could tell my grandmother.
How to engage people. I mean, I think you have to make people engage with something that they've lost. And right now they haven't lost it, right? They haven't. Right. So that's just a barrier there. But, I look at, for example, Proposition 47, which is going through now in California. Not going through, it's about to be voted on next week in California. And this is about sentencing reduction, and this has to do with all the criminal justice reforms that have been coming down the pike, actually since the Second Chance Act under Bush. And there is a huge celebrity campaign around Prop 47. I mean, Brad Pitt, Dream Hampton. It's just such a diverse array of artists who've come out behind this, and I wonder if something similar couldn't happen around net neutrality. I interviewed one of the lead writers on the John Oliver skit a few weeks ago. I actually got to him through Joe, which I'm grateful for. Thank you, because I'm always looking for different ways to tell the story, right? And in that interview, for me, the most interesting part of that interview is a young African-American guy who started up stand-up out in the Bay. He said one of the early turning points in his career when he first started out was that when he started out, people were doing stand-up, then all of a sudden his friends started to just do sketches and put them on YouTube, right? And people were watching. And he said that was the thing that showed him that he didn't just have to do stand-up. He could move into production, to being a producer, to writing his own stuff and putting it on TV, and there'd be an audience. And he was like, I have the internet to thank for all of that. And I think those kinds of stories, I rarely hear them. I don't hear them very often. I certainly don't see them in the mainstream media.
But people get them because they're understandable, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, and especially for people who are starting out. I mean, that's really what you're talking about here. This is who this issue affects. It affects marginalized people, right? So not just by race or, well, definitely by class, and definitely by starving artists. Like, that's who it affects. So once these starving artists make it, right? I would love to see some of the people who've made it and who've used the internet come back and say, hey, this is how the internet helped me. Because then I can take that and tell the story to a larger audience, and they'll get it. So I would love to see more things
That's great.
like that.
I mean, that's why we're so excited that, OK Go, who have, rock and roller friends of ours, have been engaged on this issue since, it first became an issue. And they did experience that success, that virality, that incredible, lift that came from folks discovering them on the internet, and they stay involved. He was just here yesterday. So, but keeping people engaged is something that's really tricky. And I think, Jesse, I was wondering if you could drill down a little bit further, because obviously you're trying to connect a lot of different dots, right? You're having many simultaneous conversations at once. Some of them might be about the economics of cultural production. Some of them might be about like infrastructure in local communities, what you need and what can be helpful. And then of course there's this issue. So if you're meeting a traveling band or a touring band or somebody who's just probably burned out, tired, and cranky, how do you explain this to them?
It's tricky, yeah. I mean, one of the natures of what we do is that you intersect with lots of different segments of the population all the time, from the richest to the poorest to the most urban to the most rural. And I think that one of the things I've been really happy that people are starting to really pull together in Colorado, because Colorado is actually a pretty diverse place, especially between all the urban and rural stuff as well. It's really interesting to see how many people they're bringing to the table for these kind of discussions, because I think you have sort of a pure content issue, which is how do you tell a good story, whether you're a journalist or an activist or a songwriter or whatever it is. That's a tricky one, and that's one where a lot of times you just have to do a lot of research and follow your heart, whatever that may be. But then I think once you have those compelling stories, then it's looking around and figuring out who does this affect. And fortunately, it's one of those things that pretty much everyone is the answer. So then it becomes a real effort, I think, of reaching out and having these kind of conversations in a public way with lots of different people at the table. That's the second phase of it to me.
So Joe, you have a lot of experience here. You're in communities, you're talking to a lot of different people. What's the best approach that you've found?
Well, I want to back up for a second on the journalism piece. I mentioned this at some other panel where the person was talking about whatever. It's like I used to be the deputy director for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and in 2002, we became very engaged in the media ownership fights at the FCC because we knew consolidation results in the loss of jobs for journalists and for our members. Juan Gonzalez became the president of NHJ at that time, and we worked on this very hard. First of all, two things. You started off at the beginning. The industry, the journalism industry doesn't have a stellar history in covering itself. It's not a good watchdog on its own industry. So the reason more people don't tie the issue of structural inequality in the media to their everyday lives is because we have a media system that's not invested in telling that story for obvious reasons. It's always told is in the business pages. It used to be told in the business pages all the time. It's a business story, but not a story about democracy and the impact on people's lives. Now with the journalists themselves, so we would hold sessions at our conference. In 2006, NHJ did a net neutrality panel in Fort Lauderdale. We were talking about this for a long time. Right? We had media ownership panels and plenary sessions. And most journalists, even though they work in the industry, have little clue how the industry actually works. They don't understand how the impact of policy actually impacts their ability to do their job. So when all this consolidation started happening and the newspaper industry collapsed because Knight Ridder got too big and he couldn't keep up his 29–30% profit margin and Wall Street wasn't happy, McClatchy buys Media News, and and they will continue to take on greater debt. We talked about the dangers of consolidation. We worked hard to try to get our own members involved and engaged, and more and more now care about it because they've been personally impacted. They've been laid off. So we have to, no matter how hard this issue can be. I mean, well, obviously more and more people know about this than ever before, but I've been working on this issue for a long time because, even though there may not be as many people there as I like, even though I have more company now than ever before, particularly amongst people of color, there's a basic truth that I know how this impacts our community, that we need to continue to tell that story. And so, I think Carla gave a good example for sure with the gentleman from the comedian. We just had someone that we worked with. She testified before the Senate, a woman named Ruth Olivier, who was the first, she's Latina, and she created an online web series called Ilse a few years ago because she couldn't get her shows picked up and people didn't take her seriously. She was on a popular Showtime show called Resurrection Boulevard. And she created her own web series. And she had like people like Elizabeth Pena, who just recently passed away, direct an episode. And she had Judy Reyes from Scrub. And you know, I'm on the board of the National Association of Latino Independent Producers. And we go to the conferences. What are the Hollywood executives telling young filmmakers? The internet is the lower barrier of entry. Go make your own web series, and that's your reel. You know, make that web series, so show us you have talent. So they're telling the folks to show us to have talent, go to use the internet in order to integrate the Hollywood system, to break through this Hollywood system that's been closed to them. So we need to keep the internet open for, definitely for issues of representation in the media, because we're using this media. Look at Diaries, Angry Black, she's got picked up, right? She's got picked up, and then she created an original online series. So anyway, I'm going on and on, but I'm saying the journalists, journalists themselves within newsrooms are really do not, even though they work in the industry, it's probably true in the music industry too, right? A lot of musicians don't really understand how the industry works.
Well, you know, there's these structural issues, and you end up where you end up. I mean, I was trying to maybe hint at it before, but you know, you've got 3 major labels left on the planet Earth, and they're betting on this one new distribution model. You know, even if you like it as a fan or like it as a musician, that's fine. But you know, what's the alternative? Because those companies are going to be able to cut deals with each other and the ISP. Somebody who's coming up with a new innovation that might be more artist-friendly or doesn't operate at that scale won't be in a position to. And this isn't just, and this is why I wanted to talk about, you know, we're asking for what we're asking for now. What should we be asking for the future? We don't even have, we didn't even have in 2010 protections that extended to the mobile space. And everybody knows that that's where we're consuming all this media and music. And they've all, even under the rules that they put out, they would have had ways to work around them. Here's an example. If I want to use, let's call it, you know, mainstream music service X on my iPhone, and the telecom company makes a deal with that music carrier X, they've decided that they're not going to charge me as a consumer data overages if I go over my set amount of data, right? So I'm going to be incentivized to use that, even if it doesn't treat artists very well, or even if it's, you know, not something that folks in the creative communities want to double down on. And that's a real issue. It's an issue of choice, it's an issue of competition, it's an issue of fan patronage, and it's an issue of artist sustainability. I'll get off my soapbox now and kick it back over to you guys, but I think that our audience is obviously largely with us, and my guess is, we didn't take a straw poll, but I'm sure a lot of you got involved on some level in this last round. The FCC is going to produce rules at some point. You know, they said we're going to take them at their road, and they're coming soon. What do we do? You know, can you give us a hint of what you're thinking they might look like, and then what our response should be at that point?
Look at me.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's all you, Sarah.
I think that we've got a tremendous opportunity right now. I think we've got momentum, and it's going back to your first question, Casey, of like why those turning point moments. For me, it's just been a buildup of collaboration among all different types of stakeholders in these processes. There's activists, there's people, you know, at home that are concerned about the future of their internet. There's artists, there's startups, there's large companies, and different, we're all playing different roles in coordinating all those efforts, and I think that that's really the reason where we're at now, which is a place of, I hope, optimism, that the FCC has the opportunity to get the rules right, and as you know, it turns on their willingness to rely on this, on what Jody says is the strong authority, the clear authority that provides the surest path forward. Should they get sued, which they inevitably will. And you know, it's up to them to make that decision, and I think now is the time to make your voices heard if this is an issue that you care about.
Part of the reason that we saw so much activity here was that the FCC did float a proposal that looked a lot to a lot of us in the community as a fast lane, slow lane situation. So do we trust that they've heard these 4 million folks who have weighed in?
I think that some of the comments that Chairman Wheeler has made indicates that he has heard people say that fast lanes, slow lanes, you know, that's not something that is good for the public. It's not something we want. I think one of the problems is just figuring out how best to structure rules that actually prevent that. And, you know, the commission has, after the old rules got knocked down, they put forward a proposal that we said just wasn't strong enough to actually make sure it would accomplish what Chairman Wheeler said he wanted to accomplish. For example, if you're using a fast lane, slow lane, or if you're using rules that say that you can't have fast lanes and slow lanes, the problem is just that you can't tell somebody under the law, the FCC can't tell somebody under the law that they have to provide a certain level of service if they're not actually classifying them as common carriers, right. Which is another word for Title II, telecommunications, and yeah, and it's just, on the one hand, we're seeing the FCC say we see the problems with fast lanes and slow lanes, and on the other hand, there's still a debate going on about actually pushing them to take the approach that best ensures they cannot, they can actually prohibit fast lanes and slow lanes.
And Joe, you mentioned that this problem is fundamentally political, and I hear that and I'm thinking, well, if the FCC can't get it right, where does it go? It goes to Congress, and how do we make our case in that venue as those guys are trying to update the entire swath of telecommunications laws?
Well, Casey, I'm not thinking about that one yet, you know. You know, it's like, but I mean, I still think we can win, you know. I think we can win. You know, I mean, we've come a long way. I mean, the conversation has changed. Now they're trying to use zombie words to try to disguise that they actually are with us. You know, according to Comcast, they you know, they believe in net neutrality, you know?
What are some of those zombie words? It is Halloween almost.
Well, the zombie words are like, this is
directed prioritization.
706 authority, right? We call it,
yeah.
right? It's like, you know, right? So it's like, but it's, you know, these words matter, of course,
yep.
right? Because it's the law, right? And so these are incredibly important, devil in the details, but they're trying to co-opt. They're trying to co-opt it. They're trying to, the FCC could try to disguise something that fools the public and, you know, and gets the headlines and gets some support from it, from the Hill, whatever. You know, they will do that, right? I mean, that's what they do. Right, and our job is to yell as loud as hell, saying this is nonsense, and to tell the truth, you know, and that's as simple as that. And you know, we have a lot of people with us who actually understand this more. Yesterday we had this forum in New York City, in Brooklyn, and I couldn't believe like how many people in the audience says, "Give us common carrier," you know, and they're like, "Oh, really? Wow, okay." People are getting them. Yeah. People understand. So we just have to. We have to. They're going to try they're already trying, the companies are, everyone is for, there's not a person in this town, including AT&T or Comcast, who's not for network neutrality. You know, so that means that they're trying to co-opt it, of course, and then you have to explain what real network neutrality is. So that's how the game is played. And they want rules that are just not enforceable. So they'll say, we want non-discrimination rules, and we don't want blocking rules, but we don't want any authority to enforce it. It's like saying we want we want laws to prevent voter intimidation, intimidating voters to vote and violating their voting rights, but we don't want any laws to make sure we can enforce protecting people's voting rights.
And they're going to keep using those magic invocations. One thing I've learned is that if I ever publish a book of poetry, I'm going to call it Zombie Words. So that's what I'd love for you guys to do before we go to questions, because I think you guys probably have some. Is to go around the table and just quickly describe what a win looks like for you here. And I'll start with Carla and we'll go that way.
What a win looks like for me. I'm going to answer this in a round-the-way answer. So obviously for me, I'm a reporter and I'm a journalist. I care deeply about free speech and diversity of voices. And diversity isn't just one of me in the room, right? It's multiple of me in the room. But when I take this kind of issue to either the activists who read color lines or the communities, you know, there's an issue of competition that's happening, right? So we have communities that are dealing with police brutality. We have people who are working 3 jobs and still can't pay rent and feed their kids. We have people who are dealing with, I just talked to a woman the other day who got out of jail 15 years for this much crack cocaine, who's trying to restart her life. So when I go to people like this to talk about free speech, can you imagine the look on their faces when they look at me?
Or surveillance, like surveillance.
Or surveillance.
Right.
When I go to talk to them about, this is critically important, obviously, net neutrality is critically important. Zeynep Tufekci, I hope I'm not mangling her name, she's a wonderful researcher and writer. She's online all the time, but she wrote a piece soon after Ferguson happened where she said, Ferguson would not have happened had it not been for hashtag Ferguson. And it is absolutely, completely true. I think for me, a win for me, what I would love to see is, I feel as though people are organizing around this issue within their own silos. And the communities that read color lines that I represent, quite frankly, they don't have the bandwidth to organize around this issue. They're dealing with NYPD. They're dealing with St. Louis PD. I would love to see the stereotypical people that we think of in tech, white guys, I don't know, organize with communities of color, with low-income communities of color, or not even just low-income communities of color, but rural communities, rural white communities. But I would love to see more cross-pollination of cultures around this issue. That's what a win would look like.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got a piece of it, and I think that's really elegantly described. I think they think so, too.
I guess so.
Jody, what does a win look like for you here? So we're not back here in 5 years.
Okay, so
Talking about this, we can come back in 5 years for other reasons.
So legally, a win is classifying internet access services as telecommunication services and then coming up with rules to prohibit things like blocking and discrimination and ensure transparency. Practically speaking, I think what that means is that then you would have an open internet where you don't have, you've knocked down at least some of the barriers to sharing content and accessing content. And that also will give the internet service providers incentive to actually invest in their networks, make sure they're as good as possible, make sure that they're affordable on the wireline and the wireless sides.
Sarah?
I would echo what Jody said about, about a legal win, and I take Carla's point to heart. I mean, and even in the communications industry, we are going to see that a win here doesn't stop the fight for control over what the internet means to each and every one of us. And so that fight will continue, and the fights against consolidation and decreases in competition are also ongoing, and so we'll continue. So we may still be here in 5 years, Casey, just talking about slightly different things.
You can't anticipate new technologies, and they may have to be reconsidered through a similar agonizing process, but hopefully it won't take us long.
But I think that Jody's exactly right, that this is an opportunity for the Commission to neutralize one aspect of the ISP's gatekeeper status, and we want to see a win there.
Yeah, the court to us left one path to go, and that's the path we've been talking about for years. Title II, reclassification with treating ISPs as common carriers, non-discrimination, transparency, no blocking, and I'll just say for communities of color part, I definitely agree with a lot Carla said. That's a lot of my work, and I was happy last night. We partner a lot with, we are close partners with the Center for Media Justice on the Voices for Internet Freedom campaign, represent their color change, 18 million and rising, and all that, and to do exactly what this is, to bring more attention to this issue for people of color. And I'll just be remiss if I didn't say that. One of the reasons I think, besides that we don't have better coverage of this, is because a lot of the national civil rights groups are not with us on this issue. They are on the other side, and they're more likely to get the news coverage. I mean, the mainstream media really doesn't have a terrible Rolodex. They don't know who Latino Justice Pearl Deaf is, who are with us in net neutrality. They don't know who the Hispanic Association of College and Universities are. They don't know Radio Bilingüe. These are really important institutions of the Latino community. They're with us on net neutrality, Title II. But They know the National Council of RASA, who hasn't taken a position. They know the NAACP. They know the Urban League. They know LULAC, and then maybe that's it.
Can I ask why real quick, and then we're gonna try to go to questions. My guess is it's because the ISPs are threatening to not invest in those communities.
It's a little deeper than that.
Deeper than that?
You have, I think, at least 3 reasons. You have some organizations that are ideologically aligned with the companies. They believe what the company's solution is for our community is the right answers.
Okay.
They trickle down economics, whatever. So then you have some who money is a factor. I mean, these companies have, Comcast has given $3.2 billion in cash and in-kind contribution to civic organizations since 2001. I believe that's correct, according to their filings. $3.2 billion in cash and in-kind contribution, right? And then this is less of a case these days than before, but definitely before, there's a lot of folks who just don't really, they have a good relationship with AT&T, as AT&T should be a good corporate citizen, and they say, hey, this is gonna hurt people of color. It's an issue they have no idea about or expertise, and they're like, all right, it sounds all right to us. They heard the provide this sign on. So it's a various of reasons.
So there's ongoing education issues and everything too.
And political pressure.
Jesse, real quick, can you let us know what you think a win is here?
Yeah, yeah, it feels straightforward to me. It may take 2 seconds to explain it. I hope that all of these incredibly important wins are eventually 5, 10, 50 years from now looked at as really important early battles and a much bigger thing, which to me is like kind of focuses around 2 questions. Because I don't think anybody thinks that there's never going to be another ISP. I don't think anybody thinks that we're actually fighting for the physical cables in the ground. I think the fundamental ideas here are principles about how we, our collective human evolution and ability to live and communicate together. And so I'm really curious what the next technologies are. Yeah. I mean, just in a very practical sense, and then how you build the networks, which are already being built ahead of time next time, so that we already have these things going on that we know can tackle the next big issues, which will be probably dwarf all of these things that we're talking about in 50 years. And that to me is where, to tie in everything else we've seen in the last couple of days, that's what takes artists, technology people, business people, social activists, arts education. I mean, all that stuff is like, how do we figure all this out?
Roger that, man. Like future is in the title of this organization, and I really appreciate that, desire to kind of approach it from a long view. Let's go to the audience real quick and get some questions. I see Michelle over there, and we'll pop over.
So I had the opportunity to talk to an in-house attorney at a cable company, and she kind of said, actually sort of unprompted, that, oh, I can't even talk to my liberal friends about net neutrality anymore because they believe this liberal myth that if, free from the shackles of regulation, cable companies would act bad. Like, we have no reason to think cable companies would be bad actors. But despite that argument, what confused me and concerned me is how you dispel this idea that somehow a free and open internet is anti-free market because it requires regulation. And how do we in Congress show that this isn't just a left side ideal, that it applies to both across the aisle?
Mindful of that, and I don't think that this is a partisan issue. There are lots of sort of conservative-leaning groups that have been active on this issue, company representatives, trade associations, things like that. And I think that making clear the case that this is about both the ability for all of us to access information, share information, create and share online, that's a huge part of network neutrality. But it's also, as Casey kind of alluded to, it's imperative that we keep the internet open as a platform for innovation. That innovation doesn't just happen in how internet bits are delivered to your front door. It happens in the incredible applications and services and tools that are developed on top of the internet that that users can use. And that's where I think if you talk about innovation and development in that context, I think that starts to get out at your point as well.
We'll take a question on this side.
Hi, I'm Carrie Devra, the Center for Copyright Integrity. The conversation is greater than the fast lane and slow lane. The conversation is about what's being traveled up the lanes, and that's content. Sarah, you're bold to say at a conference of creators struggling to make a living off their arts, the decision is up to users, not the ISPs. Bill Gates said content is king and people must be paid for their content. Unless the law has been changed, the decision of access to content is up to the content owners, not users or ISPs. And there is a rule, it's called Title 18, which deals with theft of property, and content is property. Important to keep that in mind. Many people here don't have a paycheck job. Many people here are pursuing their arts. They don't get unemployment insurance because they don't get a paycheck job. They don't get any of the other latitudes that come with it. We don't hear about business reports. We don't hear, we hear business or unemployment reports. We don't hear business reports and entrepreneur reports, I should say. So keep focused. Without this room, the ability for the, I'll just end it there, but it's about
I think
content.
that's a great reminder. I really do.
It's about content.
It's a really great reminder, and that's why we've always worked with the creative communities on this, because we know that, you know, it's not as simple as just like keep the lanes open. There's a lot more going on. I will say this though, and it's partly because musicians and other creators have been so active on the issue. The net neutrality rules very clearly laid out, the ones that came out in 2010, that the ISPs would, and the rights holders would have full latitude to combat infringement. And when we're talking about business models, what we want is business models that are going to serve the interests of all creators and not just a handful of companies. It doesn't matter if those companies are big media companies, big tech companies, or big internet service provider companies, big pipe, big data, big content. We want more people to participate in the, you know, economic benefits of the commercial internet and the non-commercial internet, which I think doesn't really get talked about enough. I have to go over here, but we should carry on the conversation after, but we're running out of time, so we'll go over to this side.
Two things that I think I really haven't heard mentioned at this conference much. There's been, at least I think over the last year, 2 or 3, there's been moves in state legislatures and you know, and in local legislation in different states in the country to effectively to actually outlaw government supplied broadband as the, you know, like a municipal broadband. I think they actually outlawed it in North Carolina as a carrier. You know, so I was wondering what people's thoughts on that. And my second thing that I've heard of was a number of years ago, I was at this conference. It had to be 7, 8 years ago. It was like, why Max soon? Why Max any day now? And I never heard hiding her hair of why Max since then. So I was wondering about people's comments on that. Thanks. Bye.
On the muni broadband point, it's true that, so at this point, about 30 states have enacted some sort of legislation that deregulates their ability to be in the conversation at all when it comes to telecom services. And some of those laws are saying that communities cannot create and supply their own broadband, which I think is a really terrible thing, because particularly if you're looking at communities where the biggest companies have said, I'm not interested in serving there, you're not rich enough, you can't give me a high enough profit margin, I'm just not going to build out my network to you. If the local community wants to say, well, that's fine, but we're going to do it ourselves, or if they only have one option in town and they want another, it's really important that they be able to do that. And I'll add one other issue involved with all of this is that the phone network is moving to internet protocol. And if the states have taken themselves out of the conversation and they're not able to protect people, and the FCC has not reclassified so that this internet protocol service is then, the authority for any rules over that is then subject to debate, then you have a potential, basically, disaster coming on where things could go wrong with the very fundamental of our communications network. And
Right. The audience can't hear because of the mic, but I'll just contextualize that real quick. It's basically the phones work the way they worked for the entire history of phones. You pick up the phone, I call and order a pizza, from my local joint. Domino's doesn't come on, or an operator doesn't say, we're prioritizing calls for Domino's. You call your grandmother, or I call Carla's grandmother, or she calls mine, I don't know which. The call goes through. And if we're migrating to this new system and there are no rules, then we're potentially taking an even further step backwards from the basic guarantees that we've had in the old version of the communications infrastructure. Did we have one more question there? Step on up to the mic.
It's Chattanooga, Tennessee that has this real successful local community-funded model, right? 1 gig uploads, 1 gig downloads. Hard to develop to that because the rest of the country's not on that. You don't want to develop to that type of quality. But I guess my question would be to take off his is there anything in the current legislation that is negative towards that or positive towards?
Are you talking about broadband speeds?
Yeah, broadband speeds.
Well, you know what's really interesting? It's probably a totally separate conversation. But right now, if we're not even able to really decide on what competitive broadband looks like in a global context, I'll give you an example. Comcast wants to buy Time Warner Cable, and the regulators at the Department of Justice and the FCC are looking at all kinds of factors, market concentration, Comcast is claiming DSL as part of the broadband market. We know that DSL is like that much faster than dial-up, right? If you take DSL out of that, then you've got a much more concentrated market if Comcast buys this company. So really, it's super important that the FCC looks at all the stuff that you guys just described. The ability for municipalities to decide their own infrastructure needs where appropriate, and also anything that we can do to spur investment in the higher quality networks, plus net neutrality, right? So, but that's another conference, and we'll have it later.
Yeah, that's what I meant by the debate not being over once we win this one. These things are all related, and solving one doesn't magically solve all the problems with broadband access, broadband adoption, and reaching the kind of broadband speeds that would make us competitive with the rest of the world.
I would throw in though too, Chattanooga, an amazing place, and I think it's a really good example of one of many, many amazing places from coast to coast here that are essentially, they're like, you're not going to do democracy right? I tell you what, we'll try it out in our little laboratory of democracy right here. And there's lots of those. I mean, that's the nice, there's the Free Republic of Vermont, and there's Denver, Colorado, and there's Minneapolis, and there's lots of cool things going on. And going back to what Greg and Harry were saying right before this, I think it's so crucial. This stuff is so important, but at the same time, you gotta refocus every once in a while at those local and regional levels, because those are where you have real tangible, and you provide one really cool example of a society that is somehow working, and that catches on,
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, guys, for hanging out for this panel. And when we get these FCC rules, stay tuned to everybody here. We're going to have all kinds of ways for you to respond, and it's going to be super important. So thanks for hanging in with this conversation, and thanks to the panel.